Well, I grew up in New York, and I think probably my first exposure to fiber art, it wasn't even called fiber art probably at that point, was on a trip to Sturbridge Village, which was a recreation of a colonial village. There was a woman weaving on a big floor loom, and I was fascinated. And I didn't run home and start weaving at that point, but I think it planted a seed somewhere. And then sometime around high school, where I was a little hippie, and we all wore the little Mexican blouses with embroidery, I think that may have influenced me to take up embroidery. And I remember finding a book by Erica Wilson and learning all the stitches, and then embroidering little peace signs and other little hippie things on my jeans, and there was something very satisfying about it. So that was my first foray into actually doing fiber art. So I grew up in New York, then I went to college in Chicago, went to Northwestern, and where I didn't go to art school, even though I had always been interested in making art. So outside of my formal education, I found this weaving teacher, Irene Sulioka, and I would go to her house on weekends, and she had a basement full of floor looms, and I started my weaving lessons with her, and I went from a table loom to a floor loom, started with very functional items, moved on to more what we would consider fiber art. After college, I moved to Boston, and I lived there for about 25 years, moved to Asheville in 2006, lived there for about 8 years, and then moved here to Durham, and I'm staying here forever. I'm never going to move again. I really, really like it. So my process has changed quite a bit, actually, because when I first got involved in fibers, I was a weaver, and I think I was a little fearful. Didn't have much confidence in myself as an artist, so I kind of came in through the back door. There was a big divide at that point between craft and art, and I figured, all right, maybe I can do this functional craft. I won't be calling myself an artist. So I started with that, and so my approach was it was very limited by the loom, by the right angles and the grid. For me, it was about safety, I think, and I had a very limited color palette. So even when I moved from the loom to other mixed media things where I started to combine the woven fabric with other things, it was still pretty much about the grid, about symmetry, and kind of a very structured balance. I started painting at one point, and I still had my threads in the paint. It was very textural, and then I did some three-dimensional work, some assemblage, freestanding assemblage with found objects. And then finally, a few years ago, I came back to the wonderful world of fiber. And this time I was very drawn to stitching, so I'm no longer weaving. I use fabrics that are, scrap exchange is my favorite place to get fabrics. I'm not looking for perfection in my original fabric. I'm looking for kind of used, quirky, raw fabric. And my approach is much less structured and much more spontaneous. I often think of it like improvisation, that I have the structure down, I've experienced what it is to work with that structure, and now I'm free to really improvise. and play. And so that's much more my approach now. It's very playful, it's very spontaneous. There's a Japanese philosophy called wabi-sabi, and it grew out of Zen Buddhism. And it's all about looking at the beauty of imperfection and looking at aging and atrophying and decaying and seeing the beauty in that. And so that's sort of what I'm embracing while I'm working on these pieces. Growing up in New York, I had access both to Manhattan. I was about 26 miles from Manhattan and the museums, particularly the Museum of Modern Art. I particularly loved the early to mid-century painters and sculptors. At the same time, I lived 5 minutes from the beach, and I would say my relationship with nature and my tactility and my kinesthetic sense was born from sitting on the beach, playing with the sand, the seaweed, looking for stones, being in the woods. Though that really influenced me as much as any artist, I think. And then when I did discover fiber art, the early fiber artists, so going back to Peruvian textiles, Panamanian molas, the Mexican embroidery, the quilts of G's Bend, all of those traditional arts. And then the more modern fiber artists, Annie Albers, Lenore Tawney, Claire Zeisler, Kei Sekamachi. So there was a whole new thing happening in fiber where it was recognized as something beyond home goods. And then later, when I came back to fibers, in the meantime, there had been so much going on. The 62 group in England, and Jean Draper and Sue Hotchkiss. They started in the 60s and they're still going strong. Lots of artists internationally, Olga Amaral from Colombia, Ella Natsui from Ghana and Nigeria, Esther Bornemisa from Hungary, and then people here like Sonia Clark, John Garrett, a lot of people doing things with the environment, which I'm getting more and more interested in. So Andy Goldsworthy, Chris Drury, that's quite a few influences. And every day, I mean, I'm standing here in Frank Gallery and there are ceramicists and textile artists and painters who influence me every day. I think a lot of artists feel closest to their last piece, the last piece they've done, their last baby. And this is mine. So I can talk about this piece. It's called Devagation. And I just discovered that word existed, and I love it because it means going off. A lot of my work is sort of I navigate through things. It looks topographical from on high, and yet I actually do my little journeys with thread. And devagation means kind of going off the path. So in this piece, very, very, very different from how I used to work, I increasingly don't even sketch or plan. I have a vague idea. There is the design element where I do step back when I'm working and I do place various design elements, but there's also a very involved journey, as I said, with the thread. And so I start in one corner usually. I have all these fabrics. I love the rough edges. I do a lot of this running stitch. I combine very straight lines with organic, meandering lines, and basically I have a really great time. It's very different from the approach I used to take, which was much more tentative. And I think some of that has to do with aging, with an approach to life where I am less controlling and more open to change and spontaneity. And in this piece, so I use all kinds of fabrics, mostly cottons, some linens, denims, and they're already kind of frayed, and I purposely do not do a neat finish. I really enjoy the frayed and the raw look. And then in this one, I use acrylic paint. Sometimes I spatter it, sometimes I use things to print with it, and I like the effect again of having sort of raw looking, unfinished lines. And so there's some of the printed things. And in this one, I actually drew with pencil, with a very soft graphite pencil and some marker, and there's some machine stitching, but mostly it's hand stitching. I find that I'm doing more and more hand stitching. It's both meditative and there's lots of serendipity, lots of spontaneity and surprises that happen. I really enjoyed the process. And I've always enjoyed the process of making art, but now more than ever, because I am able to sort of trust in my intuition. I don't think I mentioned my father, who was an artist, actually. He was an original madman. He, not literally, but he worked on Madison Avenue in advertising. And so we would go into the city and go to his studio, and the house was filled with art books, and he made things for the kids. He built things in the backyard, and so I joke about how we would sit around the kitchen table and debate over the merits of the typeface on the orange juice carton. So we all absorbed that feeling for design and aesthetics. So I had to give a nod to that.